Hey there, Andrea here. I hope you're doing absolutely fantastic. I'm so excited because I highlighted an amazing book this week. It's called Daring Greatly. It's how the courage to be vulnerable transforms the way we live, the way we love, the way we parent, and the way we lead. It's by Brene Brown. It is a great book. I'm sure you've heard a lot about it and or seen her quotes around all over the place. It's just such a fantastic book. And if this is your first time on the show, welcome. This is where we highlight books in 15 minutes or less. They're all to do with self-help, positive psychology, or books on well-being. So I share the content so you can make actionable changes in your life. But I always suggest that if something sparks your interest, again, it's only a highlight. So there's so much in these books that, I can't suck out all of the information. And so it's really important if something really does spark your interest or you want to delve deeper into the content, I always recommend that you purchase the book and support the author. All right, so let's jump right in. So first of all, do you think vulnerability is a weakness? So we're kind of taught that if we show vulnerability or weakness, that that it is actually a weakness. If we show vulnerability, if we show fear, or we show emotion, that vulnerability is actually a weakness. So Dr. Brene Brown, she really dispels this myth that vulnerability is not a weakness in actuality, and she argues that it is actually a correct measure or an accurate measure of courage. So vulnerability is actually a measure of courage. Who'd have thought, right? Sometimes we think that this vulnerability is actually a weakness, and that's kind of like a cultural myth. So she explains that vulnerability is at the core different emotions like fear, grief, and disappointment. But she also teaches us that vulnerability is the birthplace of love, of joy, and belonging, and empathy, and also innovation. So it's really a different look at vulnerability and how vulnerability can be the birthplace of such great things. So does feeling afraid or like you're not enough show up in your life? I know it does for me. And sometimes that fear creeps in, or that disappointment, or that, feeling that you're not good enough, it shows up for us and it kind of holds us back. And then does the idea of putting yourself out there really terrify you? Because it kind of means that you're at greater risk for getting criticized. You're at greater risk to get hurt. And you know what? I don't know, sometimes it's hard to put yourself out there because you worry, what are people going to think? Or are they going to judge me, right? So putting yourself out there is actually making yourself very vulnerable. And so you'll discover that this concept and this idea that we don't want to expose our vulnerability kind of can hold us back from a lot of great things. So do you ever wonder what it would be like if you had the courage to step into the arena, how she put it? And she talked about how the daring greatly was actually a Theodore Roosevelt. It was in one of his speeches. It was also called The Man in the Arena, like being in your life, going into the arena and performing. And so this book is so fantastic because it really teaches us that there's so much power in vulnerability, and that if we just have the courage to step into our arena, and whether that be in our relationships, whether that be in an important meeting, or in a new career or new job, or even just a scary proposal, or just daring greatly. I love that title, and it's really, really important for us it's a practice. So the way she put it in her book is that daring greatly is actually a practice, and it's a powerful new vision that allows us to just let ourselves be seen. And that expression stands out for me so much. So let yourself be seen. Isn't that amazing? Let ourselves be seen by the world. All right, so are you ready? Let's jump right in. So she talked first about what it means to dare greatly. And so daring greatly, like I said, is from Theodore Roosevelt's speech, and also called The Man in the Arena. And the message is that vulnerability is actually a form of victory. It's about knowing that you can be successful, but there's also defeat. Like you may be defeated. And it's really about understanding that there's these two elements that, yeah, daring greatly and stepping into the arena, it may come with failure, it may come with defeat, but it also can come with victory and wonderful things as well. So it's about understanding that there's a necessity in both, and that it's about engaging, so showing up in your life and being all in. And I felt that is so powerful, right? How many times have we held ourselves back just out of fear, or like worry that we're going to be judged, or heaven forbid, be vulnerable? So vulnerability is not a weakness. And the uncertainty, the kind of the risk and the emotional exposure that we face every day is actually optional, is what she put in her book. And it's a part of life. Like these emotions that come up, like this vulnerability is a part of life. And it's our choice whether or not we're going to engage. Because let's face it, vulnerability, these emotions and these weaknesses and these risks are going to show up for us regardless. So it's kind of up to us to choose if we are going to engage in our life, because those things are going to be there regardless. Like emotional exposure that we face every single day, it's not an option. It's just going to be there. So I thought that was so interesting how she put it. So why not just engage in your life? So our willingness to own and engage with our vulnerability determines the depth of our courage. Isn't that crazy? So let's say that again. So our willingness to own and to engage with our vulnerability and to show up, and our level of engagement actually determines our courage, the depth of our courage. And that helps us move into our life, is to kind of just like be with our vulnerability and show up and engage in our life despite it. So yeah, so it's a really interesting, and it's really powerful, don't you find, like to think about showing up in your life. So the level to which we protect ourselves, and we kind of protect ourselves from the world judging us, from these vulnerabilities, it actually it can hold us back. It's a direct reflection to the measure of our fear. And so if we're scared of something and we're disconnecting from the world, we're actually disconnecting from our greatness, from our ability to really show up. And I love the way she put that in her book. So daring greatly is not about waiting until the perfect bulletproof approach in life. It's not about that waiting until you're perfect, till you're like basically bulletproof, you're not going to be attacked before you walk into that arena, so to speak. So it's not about waiting for perfection. It's not about waiting till you're bulletproof and you're not vulnerable. It is all about showing up despite the fact that you're not perfect, despite the fact that you're not bulletproof, and walk into that arena, so to speak. So if we do these things, if we don't step into our arena, we could be sacrificing amazing opportunities and greatness that, that's not recoverable. Like if we let those opportunities go because we're waiting for perfection, we're waiting to be bulletproof, then we might miss huge amounts of opportunity. And so that's so incredible, isn't it? And then she talked about, and I love the way she put it, we're basically squandering our time, our gifts, and our unique contributions that only we can make to the world. And that is so true, right? We're holding back our greatness and what the world could see of us because we're worried about exposing this vulnerability. So the world needs you. And this is what she said in her book, and that we need to dare to show up in our lives and let ourselves be seen. I love that. This is vulnerability. This is what she's talking about within her book. All right. So then she moved into this whole concept of looking at the never enough. How often do you feel like you're not enough? How often, do you hold back because you're worried that you're not enough, or that maybe you're not smart enough, maybe that you're not slim enough, maybe you're not, right? This not enough culture is crazy. And so the idea is that we want to show up and let ourselves be seen, but it requires that we dare greatly, and it requires that we be vulnerable. So we need to examine this idea of never enough and this never enough culture. So we often shift and have this shame-based fear, like, oh my gosh, I'm not good enough, or oh, I'm not the best mom and wife and career woman. There's shame around certain things and that we're not good enough. So the fear of never feeling, extraordinary or enough to be noticed or to be lovable and to belong, this is the never enough problem. So basically it's scarcity thinking. So it's kind of like we're living in this scarcity mode of that we're not good enough, that we're never perfect enough, that we're not, powerful enough, that we're not successful enough. And this is sad, right? So think about what self-defeating statements that you're saying to yourself, or that you're thinking. Like, what are those self-defeating statements that are holding you back, that are making you that you're never good enough, or that you're never going to be there? So she really is emphasizing to really look at this, because this is really powerful. So where do you think your never enough thinking comes from? Like, where does it come from? Are you comparing yourself to others? Do you feel that sense of shame, or like you fear that someone's going to judge you or ridicule? Is it coming from that? Or I think comparison is a huge form of that, this never enough culture. If you're comparing to get inspired, that's different. Whereas if you're comparing to kind of rank yourself, then that really is going to make us feel like there's never enough. Let's face it, there's always going to be someone that's, meeting the goals that we wish we could reach. And there's always going to be someone who's not quite there yet. So this comparison in terms of ranking is, it's going to make us feel like we're not good enough, or that we're not successful enough. The other thing is this whole idea of disengagement. So we just simply don't even try. We don't try things because we disengage from our life because we feel like we're not enough or good enough. Isn't this scarcity culture kind of a little scary? And it affects our willingness to, own our own vulnerability. And this never enough thinking actually holds us back. And it doesn't allow us to embrace our vulnerabilities and really engage in our world. So she talked about how shame sends gremlins in to fill our heads with messages of self-doubt and self-criticism, this never enough voice, or this gremlin that shows up, and it fills our head with these, self-doubt, self-criticism voices. So sometimes, you can ask yourself, like, well, what is this gremlin saying to me, right? So shame is intensely painful feelings or experiences that believing that we're kind of flawed in some way, or that we're not worthy. And for women, typically the pressure to look perfect and do perfect, and anything less and looking like anything less is actually shaming. And then for men, it could be anything from, if they reveal weakness, heaven forbid, men be viewed as weakness. If there is weakness, then there's shame in that. So you can see that this never enough culture is actually really, really, it's holding people back from really embracing this vulnerability, so we don't actually engage in our life. All right, so she had some action tips. I love action tips. So here are some of her action tips. So she talked about practicing courage and reaching out. And she also talked about talk to yourself. Say, you're okay. You're human. We all make mistakes. I love that because it's so true. We all are human. Let's give ourselves permission to be human. Embrace that vulnerability and to own your own story. So know that everything you've gone through, just own it. And, don't feel like you have to justify out, why it is that you were vulnerable. That vulnerability, that story actually has strength and courage. And your story actually demonstrates how courageous you are, that vulnerability. She also talked about there's a gift in imperfections. I love that. So manage perfectionism because perfect isn't a thing, right? And it holds us back. So she also talked about that all parts of our being, allow it to be seen. So don't put on a persona. Don't be a persona. Like, your Instagram profile is your persona, right? But you know what? What's real? What's your real story? Sometimes post vulnerability. And so remember that a lot of what we're seeing is a persona of someone. And the idea is that just know that you're enough. And she talked about leaning into joy and embrace our experiences, embrace our vulnerability, our stories, right? That's what makes us us. She talked about practicing gratitude in the ordinary moments, and that's really powerful, that we are enough, and appreciate the beauty in the cracks. And she talks about appreciate the beauty of cracks, right? So we all are going to have little cracks here and there, and there's beauty in that, beauty in imperfection. So she talked about practicing mindfulness and also common humanity. We're all human. We all make mistakes. We're not our persona. We are actually human, and everyone has vulnerability, and everyone has, moments of challenge and things like that. So let it all hang out is the way that she put it within her book. And so then we go on to vulnerability myths. So the myth is that vulnerability is a weakness. We already talked about this a little, but she really defines vulnerability as uncertainty, as risk and emotional exposure, and that vulnerability actually sounds like truth, and it actually feels like courage. So vulnerability, if you think about it, whenever you've heard someone talk about something that that they're going through, or they've made themselves vulnerable, don't you listen to it in a different way? Doesn't it come across as courageous? Doesn't it come across as very truthful and authentic? So she came up with a few examples, and she talked about a few examples within her book. And, statements of vulnerability such as getting pregnant after 3 miscarriages. Right? There's vulnerability in that. And doesn't that sound, and it feels really truthful, and it feels very courageous to say that and express it, and there's strength in there. She also talked about the first date after my divorce, right? So there's vulnerability there, but actually, you know what? Vulnerability actually sounds like truth, and it feels like courage. I love the way she put that. So next time you hear someone talking and being vulnerable, notice what comes up for you. It usually, that person, they seem like they're courageous actually to share that truth with you. So she's shifting our kind of the myth of this vulnerability, that vulnerability is actually weakness, because really it's not. It's truth, and it feels like courage. So powerful. All right. So the tip that she came up with is this vulnerability prayer. I love it. Okay. So she says, give me the courage to show up and let myself be seen. Like, I'm writing this on a Post-it note, and I'm sticking it in my washroom on the mirror, or I write it places on your mirror, or have it so that it's the kind of your vulnerability prayer where you can say it and have it available to you. Give me the courage to show up and let myself be seen. You know what? Cracks and all, right? So ask yourself, what would I attempt to do if I knew I could not fail? And this is really helpful because it'll help us kind of engage in our life. And so what is worth doing? Like, even if you fail, half the time, most of the time, it still has benefit to it, right? There's still learning in there. And it's so powerful, right? Engaging in our life. And so it's a waste of time to evaluate our worthiness, she's saying, by weighing ourselves to the reaction of the people that are, and the way she said it, in the stands, right? The people in the back, it's a waste of us evaluating our worthiness by thinking about what those people up in the stands are thinking, right? So really, it's, who cares? Like, show up in this world and just as you are, and just, expose that vulnerability. And the people who love you are within arm's reach, is the way that she put it in her book. And they're going to support you, and they'll support you when you dare greatly. I love that. So there's the myth of vulnerability, that it's a weakness. It's actually a strength. Cool. All right. So to cultivate change, the whole next section within her book was all about cultivating change. And she talked a little bit about mind the gap. And in the coaching model, we always talk about this gap, like where you want to be, where you are, and the gap between it. So minding the gap in between, that sort of thing. So daring is actually a strategy that you can pay attention to that space between where you actually are standing right now and where you'd like to be. And so it requires that we embrace vulnerability and cultivate that, she called it shame resilience. So it's like, even though we feel, or maybe we have that not enough sort of feeling or that shame around it, embracing that and just kind of showing up and knowing the gap of where you stand, where you want to be, and just paying attention to the space between those, and then embrace vulnerability so that you can show up even in uncomfortable ways, right? So we don't need to be perfect, just engage and commit to your values and your actions and your goals and where you want to go. So the way she talked about it is to cultivate this change in our life is to think of it as a strategy or like a game plan or kind of like a detailed answer to a question. Like ask yourself, what do you want to achieve and how are you going to get there? I find that so powerful. What do you want to achieve? How are you going to get there? And you know what? Just do the steps that are required. So think about goals as what you want to accomplish and the steps that you need to take in order to be successful. And then notice what's getting in the way of you getting there. So what's getting in the way of that? Are there expectations? Are there rules? Are there what your stories, past failures, perhaps mistakes, not perfect enough, not enough mentality? So what's holding you back from where you are, where you want to go? What's the gap? What's holding you back? And so she's suggesting that we really focus on that gap between where we are, where we want to go, and what do we need to disrupt that thinking or those stories or that never enough mentality. And so she's talking about rehumanizing it and really engaging with vulnerability, and notice the things that you might be vulnerable and what might be holding you back, but then engage anyway, embrace vulnerability. So she did have action tips here too as well. She talked about paying attention to the space between where you are and where you want to go, and then to remember that we disengage from our life in order to protect ourselves from vulnerability, from shame, and from feelings of loss. So she's really about recognize and combat this shame. And she talks about focusing on your strengths and opportunities instead of faults and limitations. So focusing on your strength, embracing this vulnerability, and be open to feedback as well with some of her suggestions, and to find the courage to be vulnerable and to share feelings of not knowing and not knowing what you're doing, right? Admitting to it. When I first started this podcast, I had no idea what I was doing, right? And that vulnerability, stepping out and engaging and just doing it, right? To moving into action despite vulnerability. What are people going to think about this? Are people going to listen, or am I going to have crickets? Nobody listening. All right. So shifting from controlling to engaging. So really engage in your life. Show up in that arena. Dare greatly. All right, so this book, Daring Greatly by Brene Brown, so powerful. Vulnerability is not a weakness, but rather it's a measure of courage. I found that was so powerful, and our willingness to own and engage with our vulnerability determines the depth of our courage. That's the underlying message here. And Daring Greatly is actually a practice, and it's a powerful new vision of letting ourselves be seen. I love that expression, letting ourselves be seen. Let the world needs to see you, right? So what stood out for me and resonated for me the most was this idea of that daring greatly is not kind of waiting until you are perfect or waiting until you're bulletproof to show up. It's all about just, you know what, jumping in there and engaging in your life despite, you know, this vulnerability. Embrace it and really walk into that arena. That's what stood out for me. That's it, my friends. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you got a lot out of this one. Oh, this book is so powerful, and I really encourage you to purchase it. There's so much more in there, obviously, than I could highlight, but I hope you enjoyed it and have a wonderful day.